Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and to meet some new faces, and I really do very much appreciate this whole ministry, and I know you do, those of you who come to it regularly. And I feel pretty honored to be speaking here again, and to be speaking with Denis again. Denis and I have talked a couple of times before, not about this particular topic. This is the first time we've done this one. But we do a sort of team tag. He sits in the bar stool. He just told me his body was made to sit on a bar stool, which I don't really think I can claim the same myself. But anyway, this particular topic, I must say, theologian I may be, but in many ways there's not an awful lot in church teaching about pornography in terms of the specifics. Of course, it's a very broad teaching, and it's very clear to everybody that Catholic teaching is very much against it. But what to say beyond that? Some of my family were over yesterday afternoon, the grandkids were playing, and one of my sons said to me, "So what's on tomorrow night, Mom?" So I told him, and two of them said to me, "But you don't know anything about pornography." And I thought, exactly, and that really is the way I intend it to be. But in terms of it, as usual, it's a case of, do I have to be an adulterer to know that adultery is wrong? Do you have to know about the material to know that something's wrong? When we're talking about it from a Catholic perspective, there is no question that when we say that the church is saying that it's against pornography, why is it against pornography? Because it's really from a positive point of view, first of all. We're really looking at, as in terms of that very lovely opening prayer, then we're looking at ourselves as temples of the Holy Spirit, which always sounds very grand, but in fact is a reality which, when we really look at it from that perspective, gives us such a different attitude towards what we do with the human body. We know that sexuality in Catholic teaching is regarded as something very good and very positive. And we talk frequently about the purposes, the ends, if you like, of sexuality, especially the sexual act, as being the unitive acts and the procreative acts. So when we're talking about pornography, we're not so much perhaps looking there at the procreative aspects, but we're certainly looking at the unitive aspects. And what we're saying is that in that sexual relationship, in the act of sexual intercourse, what's really at stake for most people is the act itself, the pleasure it brings, but what it does for the couple, what it does for the couple's relationship. It is an expression of love. And at that level, that's where we value it. That's where we see the source of God's goodness. And we're seeing it too, not just as something that happens giving instant pleasure, which it frequently does, most often does, but we know that those unitive dimensions really help the couple to develop their own personal and psychosexual relationship. And so, if you like, things only get better as the relationship progresses. So when we're looking at something like the sexual act from the positive point of view, I think it indicates where the problems lie when we get into something like pornography. So we could say that if we're going to call pornography a sin, objectively speaking, the church is just saying it's wrong because it harms people and it harms the sexual relationship. And many people will say, but tell me why it's wrong, because many people don't think there's anything of that wrong with porn. And maybe especially at the soft end as opposed to the other end. But the church is sort of saying it's all wrong because now there's a distortion of the human body. So we're talking about objectifying people and not just objectifying women. We're talking about an aspect of lust. When we talk about the 7 deadly sins, that's what it would be called. But when we're talking about pornography, so often people are using it, and it usually is men, although obviously not exclusively so, but using it for arousal, that idea. And so that self-centeredness aspect is another part of what the church is considering to be the wrong aspect of it. That the sex act wasn't just meant for oneself. It's so terrific, in fact, that it really does deserve a relationship. And it's not just the self-centeredness of somebody just getting into that whole question of arousal, but it's what then develops perhaps in that person, himself or herself, and the seeking out of that type of moment, the seeking out of that type of experience. And then, of course, if the person's in a relationship, then the exclusion of the other party. Even if the other person doesn't know, but there is still harm being done in the sense that the person using the porn is keeping something to himself or herself, or certainly keeping something back from the other person. And I think we all know that statistically when people do find out, especially if somebody is using porn to a really ridiculous level, that it's one of the major causes of divorce. I mean, it really does come between a couple and the couple's relationship. The other thing too, and not incidentally, is that it does promote gender stereotyping. And these days when people are very concerned about the treatment of women in society, then there's no doubt that the type of picture, the type of material that's being used, that was hardly, you could hardly say it's sort of it upgrades women in people's eyes. Most people use the opposite verb and will say it degrades women in people's eyes. And I think that's a very important context as well. So I think those particular aspects, when we're talking about porn from the sin point of view, are points that we have to keep in mind. And I think myself that the most important aspect of all of that is the concern about reducing the other person to a sex object. And also, although it gives some kind of relief, the physical relief of tension, relief of sexual desire, that kind of thing, it apparently, according to people in the know, in terms of people who counsel people who have problems thereafter, is that it's really so superficial that it just doesn't allow the person then to be a full person himself or herself. In other words, it kind of breeds anxiety and depression and an inability sometimes to engage in an ordinary sexual act because of the need for that other type of stimulation. So it's a pretty heavy-duty concept, even just coming at it from that point of view. So I think it's time for Denis to take on from there. Okay.
Oops. I better not pull this thing apart. So I'm Denis Costello. I'm a clinical social worker and practiced psychotherapy for years with Catholic Family Services, which is not Catholic Children's Aid, but is in fact a counselling agency. And I think from my side, there's a lovely phrase. I'm a big fan of sacred space. And their thought, about a month or two ago, was a lovely phrase where they said, you know the way they have the thought for the week on it? For those of you who don't know it, sacredspace.ie, Irish Jesuits, quality product. Got to promote, There's that lovely phrase, whatever is present to me shapes my becoming. And very often people will come to me in counselling saying, I'm not happy what's happening to me. I don't like who I am in the relationship. I don't like what I'm doing in my life. I don't like what I've become. And therefore we begin in working with people to help them begin to shape their selves in a way. And this is a practice, I was going to say as old as the hills. It's actually not quite as old as the hills. It was started with guys like Socrates and Aristotle. Some of the ideas were taken up by St. Augustine in the early Christian church. St. Ignatius whipped some of the ideas from them well from the ancient Greeks. And these are very ancient practices about how we can shape ourselves. So if you're in Toronto, you're suffering a lot of stress, a lot of worry, a lot of concern, and you don't want to take medication, the odds are you'd be advised to take mindfulness, some course of mindfulness meditation. And if you did it consistently over time, the odds are that your worry, your depression, your anxiety would drop. It's quite a good way of working, very ancient. Equally well, if you decided to take your faith seriously, if somebody at some stage would say, well, you should get yourself a spiritual director. You know, the old adage, if you have yourself as a spiritual director, you have a fool for a director. So you'd be advised to kind of go and talk to somebody. And what that you would probably be advised to do was to sort of start going to daily mass, start to say daily prayers. You might be invited to do spiritual reading, some kind of reflective reading of the scriptures, the Lectio Divina that the Cardinal does down in the cathedral. You might be invited to start reciting the Psalms or the Breviary. These are the practices that you would be advised to do. And over time you'd notice in that famous phrase, the will to pray would become the wish to pray. It would begin to shape you. So we know that just as if you have a good diet and you exercise, you should be reasonably physically healthy. Equally well, if you don't do that, you'll probably get unhealthy. Well, after the age of 40, you can't take your physical health for granted, nor can you take your mental health for granted. And therefore you have to be very careful about what you let into your brain. And porn is not good stuff to let into your brain. Remember, whatever is present to me shapes my becoming. And the kind of porn we're talking about, gonzo porn, I've been thinking a lot about porn. Moira and I have been researching porn. I went onto one of the sites for about 30 seconds and got scared and ran out of it like a shot. So obviously we're not experts in porn, and I don't think we're going to go down that route either. But there's a researcher, Gary Wilson, who has a U-Brain on Porn website, and he puts it very nicely. He said, what worries them most is that it's shaping sexual arousal patterns. It shapes your sexual arousal pattern. And then the classic, many of you done Psych 101 and know the Coolidge effect. Well, there's no way I'm telling the Coolidge effect while I'm on that camera. But come to me afterwards and I'll explain the little story. There's a cute story with it. But basically, you need to have either different partners or different activities to get the same dopamine hit every time you watch porn. So it has to get either more aggressive or there has to be more people, and it just goes down the spiral stairs. And his worry is that we're getting kids starting at about grade 7 who are starting to watch porn and starting to get their arousal pattern shaped by it. So remember, what is present to you shapes you. That's what you'll become. The other thing, and Moira touched on it, is porn is educating our young people as to what it is to be a man or a woman. We all had heroes when we grew up. I grew up in the Stone Age, so Bernie Flintstone was my hero, but I've been in a lot of therapy for that, and I'm much better now. But we all have heroes that we emulate, sports stars, soccer stars, whatever it is. But these young people are being educated as what it is to be a man or a woman. And what it means to be a man in the kind of porn that is being watched, gonzo porn, is to be aggressive and abusive. There was an article in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago where they were covered. The comment was that men are asking women for anal sex persistently, even though they're saying no, they don't want to do it. So they're learning what it is to be a man by being aggressive, being assertive, looking only for their own pleasure. And the other message that women are getting, they're getting the message that they need to lighten up, that porn is cool, and that submissive is the way to go. So I think it's a really pernicious shaping of the individual. And that's the first part of our talk this evening, is to talk about what's the effect on the individual. The wages of sin or death is pretty kind of old style, but it's absolutely right. It will kill your own psyche and shape yourself. What is present to me has a hold on my becoming, and it becomes really important to think about who you want to become and how you want to shape the psyche that God has given you. Okay, Moira? Mm-hmm. Next bit. This is a very sophisticated and well choreographed dance, as you will notice.
Dancing with the Stars. No. Actually, then it's just a couple of things everything you said registered, but a couple of things really made me think off the cuff again a bit too. I mentioned grandchildren earlier, and just this, we've all become aware, Stone Age or not, that the influence of the web is so all-pervasive, and so that whole question of access is obviously so much more straightforward than it ever used to be, which of course doesn't help in terms of shaping people and shaping them now even younger. Because some of the stats that I did look at, the number of porn hits there are in a day is something like 11 million. And in any event, who's counting, as they say, and is that only in North America? I don't really know. The numbers, in a sense, maybe don't matter as much as we all know that it's massive, and it's a massive industry. But the other thing is, so many young kids also have smartphones, and they're downloading this stuff right off their own family computers onto their own phones and sending it to each other. One of my daughters, who is a teacher, was telling me a few stories about kids in grade 8, and I guess to my sort of innocent ears, it really, I found it extremely disturbing, because again, of not just the fact that it's porn, if you like, it's not just a reactive thing, it's a realization of what's actually going into their young minds, especially at that almost pre-adolescent age when they're not fully formed and they don't really appreciate what they're getting into, and the danger at that level is really something quite incredible. The converse side, when we're talking about something in Catholic teaching as beautiful as theology of the body, of course doesn't really look at something like pornography, and of course not, because it's really stressing mastery, self-mastery. It really is always emphasizing the virtue of chastity, a word that people don't seem to want to know about these days, and yet is so absolutely fundamental for every single one of us as individuals. Whether single, whether married, whether priest, whether religious, it doesn't matter. This virtue of chastity is something that everybody has to be involved with. And really, chastity does mean that self-mastery, that it's something that I control myself. And as with any other area in our lives, that whole question of discipline and looking at our body again through this prayer, and really talking to God and being much more aware of just the beauty side of sex and the sexual relationship, which our church is constantly stressing, is something I think that can really, really help. I think that self-mastery thing is just so important though, because that's what seems to go out the window for many people when we're talking about porn. And the trajectory does seem to be, again, as Dennis was saying, moving along from either numbers of times that people are viewing, or moving, unfortunately, along the spectrum from softer porn to much more hardcore porn. And then, of course, although I mentioned lust in terms of sin in the first couple of things that I was saying, now we're also moving into something like violence as well. And the harder the porn, the more violent it is. Just very briefly, I remember many years ago, I mentioned this to Dennis and Vanessa when we were talking about this. There was a tape made by the Ontario Provincial Police, and it was called Project P, and it was on porn. And the idea of the tape was to sort of sensitize people who would be working as counsellors in that area. And I was teaching a course in sexuality at St. Jerome's at that point. The course was in Kitchener, and somebody invited me along to see this tape, and it did start, if you like, with some really soft porn that was almost laughable. You could at least you could see there was a sense of humour in it, but it quickly progressed right through. I don't want to remember it frankly, but right through even to the snuff movies, which in the early 90s were being made. And frankly, I didn't think that was true. I thought that was something that people just talked about, but was assured that in fact what we were watching wasn't made up, if you like. As you can imagine, I couldn't sleep for months after that. It's just so incredibly violent. And the idea that people then take something like sexuality and are able to distort it completely into something that it was never meant to before is something that I think would probably make a lot of us draw back, even from thinking that something like, the Playboy magazine type of effort was something that you could classify as not harmful, especially from that point of view of the way the trajectory actually grows. So something like that kind of violence, I think, puts it in a very different perspective when people are talking about porn, and I don't think it's an area we should be forgetting about. When we talk about that whole question of the person as an object or a subject, I think that's, again, so important, just ordinary human relationships. Not one of us wants to be looked upon as an object. All of us are subjects. We talk about this radical equality before God of us as individual subjects. And if we are individual subjects, that is how we are to look on other people. And the difference again between that and this whole question of objectifying people and using them for our own purposes becomes very clear. When we talk about what intimacy really is, intimacy that love and permanent relationships can be built on, friendships too, of course, we're talking about qualities like mutuality. It's not there in porn. We're talking about reciprocity, a real sharing between the partners, likewise. We're talking about true unity, where we're really trying to develop ourselves and our partner to the best of our abilities. Certainly not in porn. And just at the very bottom line, when porn is just used like that, when we're just either using sex as an expression of our own sexuality, I think the bottom line there is that sex can mean absolutely anything. And the only thing that it doesn't mean is love. And that again is sort of totally counter to what most of us are actually looking for. Sorry.
So the pattern that Moira and I are working on is we've talked about the effects of pornography on the individual. And then the second layer we did, and we're doing now, is talking about the effect of pornography on relationships, on a couple relationship. And then we finish up talking about the effect of pornography on our faith community and on our society. And I think as a marriage and family therapist, one of the things that I see, I mean, there's no glamorous side to the porn I see, because the people I will have seen generally are couples, or else there's an individual like a parent or a person coming and saying they've discovered their partner is using porn. And it's never good news. And it's never that he bought a Playboy magazine. I'm old enough to remember the old VHS tapes. This young woman finding out that her boyfriend had a garage full of them. And I'm obviously a simple lad from Ireland. I was stoned. I didn't know they made that much. I subsequently learned that Hollywood makes about 400 movies a year and the porn industry makes 11,000. And that there are 26 million pages of porn on the net if you have time to watch them all, Moira. Like, it's a stunning amount of stuff. I mean, obviously I'm way out of my league here. But one of the things that's very clear is just the amount of grief it causes. It causes a tremendous amount of pain and suffering when porn is discovered. And I mean, I was away on vacation and we were on the beach and a couple of young fellas came around, about a half dozen of them, and shade was hard to get on the beach, so we were all kind of clamped underneath the tree. And they were yakking away about life. So I was kind of pretended to be asleep and I listened to them. And they were talking about, could you get married, and could you be married for life, and could you be faithful to one partner? And they were great young fellows. It was a very respectful conversation, even if they'd encroached on my space, in my part of the beach, and were having beer with their sandwiches for breakfast. Beer for breakfast. But they were on their holidays. So at the end I went over to them and chatted with them for a while, and they were great young guys, I must say. It was a very respectful conversation, very thoughtful, and they were asking the right kinds of questions. And I think they were trying to figure out the key component to life, which is the ability to develop a few good, intimate relationships. The key element in life, a few good friendships, whether it's dating, whether it's engagement, whether it's marriage, whether it's just a couple of good friends. Making and keeping good relationships is what makes life so much better. I mean, and just the humor and the fun you have is just so great. And I think that there are two things, and I've been at this racket for a while. I don't put in the old grey stuff like kind of before I come down here so you might listen to me. This is actual genuine grey hair. I think some of you folks have it too, I'm glad to see. And a couple of things I've learned. One is that there seems to be two things necessary for a good, long-term, stable relationship. And one of them I call faithful loyalty. fidelity is maybe an overterm, but faithful loyalty. And by that I mean that you are loyal to your partner, whether she's your girlfriend, your fiancé, your wife, your husband. That loyalty is there faithfully. And I mean by that, they're the first to hear your good news, they're the first to hear your bad news. You share your life with them. The church defines marriage as a partnership of the whole of life. This is the person you share your life with. Therefore, if you bring porn into that relationship, as Isaac Abel, who is a blogger who described himself as being addicted to sex and then has a blog that he writes about, he says, porn's most significant disruption is the wedge it creates between us and our intimate partner. And particularly bringing porn into the home, whether on your phone or on your internet, is experienced as tremendously offensive. It's like sleeping with your mistress in your bedroom. It's tremendous. It's hard to explain how emotionally powerful it is. I think faithful loyalty also has a companion, and it's called respect. We need to respect and esteem our friend, our girlfriend, our partner, our wife, our spouse. And bringing porn into the home breaches the boundary and says, the respect goes. Is that what you think of women? Is that what you think of me when you're making love? Is that what you want me to be like? And we're all quite insecure in terms of our sexual performance. I think that's not uncommon. And therefore, bringing that in breaches the faithful loyalty and the respect that's key to marriage. I joke, there's only about 3 things you need not to do to stay happily married. See if I can remember them now. First one is don't do abuse. That's real faith. That no matter what they tell you, that kills your marriage. The second one, give more positives than negatives, 7-1 when you're meeting. And the third one, and you love this, I mean, I tell this to clergy and no wonder I get promoted. Go to church more than 3 times a month. These are the 3 things that are correlated. Research, solid research, US admittedly, but it's research, but are solid. Not spending, that's subject for another day, but solidly correlated. And in my own experience, where there is faithful loyalty and where there is respect, the marriages last, are solid, and more than that, are deeply rich, fun places to live. Okay, Moira, you're on the last lap.
I'm glad you didn't ask me what the 3 things were. I might come up with something different.
And you might have been right.
No, I'm sure there's multiple answers, but those ones are really good. I just remembered that something that I didn't say earlier was something that really always strikes me again when we're talking about things like pornography, as if in some ways it's people will maybe feel as if they're empowered or that they're gaining something, or that this is something special, even though most often it's covert and hidden, which tells us something. And even, and I was listening to some of those same things, Dennis, people still talk about the sort of, why do you have to hide that kind of thing? There is a residual guilt perhaps about it, that people actually know that what they're doing isn't something that is at heart decent. They don't want somebody else to find them looking at things like that, no matter what the age perhaps. But the older you get, the more knowledgeable people are, the more then you would think it would actually hit people. It's kind of different with kids. I see them in many ways as maybe not entirely innocent, but they're certainly victims. When you don't really know the harm that this can do, then we're, in terms of that societal element, so porn isn't just harming the individual, and I think it's because of a lack in people. It's either a lack of confidence or a lack of trust or a lack of intimacy, or who knows what the lack is. And so people like Dennis, people who ask about how can I stop doing this, the spiritual response doesn't seem to be enough when the problem is deep. The spiritual response of praying, of course, is extremely important. That idea of, I want to stop doing this, I know it's wrong, if you like, that's the spiritual aspect, but I need help to do it. And so a few priests I know whom I've talked to about, people have talked to them in confession, they will say that they will try and talk to the person outside or recommend that they go and speak to somebody. Because again, the harm that is done to the individual, even although it doesn't seem as if it's harm, once they start trying to move away from it and recognize it, it is actually quite deep. Because our attitudes have been so skewed, our ideas about sexuality are so distorted, and sometimes that feeling of guilt for oneself really makes one not like oneself that much either. So there's a lot to be fixed. And of course, if that's the case with the individual, then as Dennis is saying, it affects the marriage. We know about divorce statistics. It must affect in some ways the children. Again, maybe in an unknown kind of way, but I mean, I think if I knew my husband was looking at, kiddie porn or something like that, could I possibly trust him with my children? Could I trust him with anybody else's children? I mean, these things are really pervasive. And I think there's a societal element as well when we just sort of pretend that it doesn't matter, that soft porn is just okay, you can shrug it off, and maybe because it doesn't bother me and I can't shrug it off, maybe I'm forgetting that there's other people who can't shrug it off quite as easily. And I could be doing something about that instead of pretending that this is something that's not that harmful. It seems, on the other hand, to be extremely harmful. Also, societally, and I find this in other areas too, I think people sometimes don't remember this, but if you're paying for, I know so much of porn is free these days that it's maybe not quite the same problem, but some sites, as you know, the deeper you go into it, you do have to pay. And so even in that payment, then we would be entering into that whole area of corruption of people making money out of other people's weaknesses. And just by that simple act of buying into it, although we think that's just about me, we've actually joined that wider circle that means that these people can still go on, making more material for more and more people to view. So some of those points I think we can remember as well. We shouldn't ever think that it's just a personal thing, that it's just about me and how I react. As with most other things in society, the levels of harm are sometimes insidious, but when we stop and think about them in a different way, I think we sometimes see something like porn in a different way too.
So just to wrap up, and I know we've gone a tiny bit over time, Vanessa, but sorry about that. To see with true contrition. I think there's some skeptics here. When I was preparing this Sunday, a couple of Sundays ago, the reading from St. Paul, the second reading was from Romans, where he says, "Do not conform yourself to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." I just love the intelligence and the wisdom of our tradition. Because as Moira said, porn is ubiquitous. I remember it became a joke. I date myself when I remember the TV program Friends, but I'm glad to know that it's still running. And there was an episode where Chandler and Joey accidentally got onto a free porn site, and then were terrified to turn the TV off or do anything. And what struck me about it is that it was such a joke that you could watch endless porn, that it kind of normalized it, and now we have erotica, and you can actually get it down in your bookstore down the street. And yet our tradition says we have a different vision. It's not that we're against things, though we are, of course, but it's also that we have a different vision. We have a vision not to be conformed to this world. We have a vision of marriage that talks about the unitive dimension of marriage where the two become one flesh, not just physically, but of course physically, but also spiritually at the deepest level they can be when they become co-creators of new life with God. And we also talk about the oblative dimension, the self-giving dimension of Christian marriage and of Christian living, where we give of self so that others might have life. whether you're doing that for a friend, whether you're doing it a favor for your parents, whether you're doing something for your kids. It's a very central part of what makes us Christian. And the hoot about the whole thing is it gives us a very rich way of life. And I know pornography appeals to the fallen, sinful side of our nature, and we neglect the temptation at our peril. None of us is immune from it. It cultivates a very negative side of us. But as St. John Paul said when he was in Downsview many years ago, to the young people he said, "You are more than the sum of your desires and your wants." He saw the best in us and called it out. So our faith tradition offers us a vision of interpersonal relationships that are rich, deeply satisfying, and respectfully intimate. Such relationships call out the best in each other. When we treat each other with deep respect, they can be a source of great joy, and I have to say, great laughter. So thank you very much, and over to you, Vanessa.